cash actually gives you freedom. But with a CBDC, the government is going to be able to look at every single transaction that you make. And what if you're spending too much money with things that the government doesn't approve of? If they've got ultimate power over your currency in the bank, don't you think they're going to take some sort of action there? And for those people who say, come on, Neil, this is never going to happen, none of this stuff will happen. Well, remember, these are the same people that said 2 years ago that this, virus issue would be gone within 6 months. You see, money velocity is a very important concept, because if you just take a $100 bill and you put it under your mattress, well, the velocity ends there. It doesn't go anywhere. But if you take that $100, you spend it somewhere, that person then spends it, that person then spends it, you've now got a velocity of, say, 3 or 4. Guess what? Each time that money goes from person to person, the government is taxing that money. So of course, they want to create more tax money and more money velocity. So what they trialed in China very successfully, there was a 90% success rate with this project, was to give people CBDC into digital wallets, but then put an expiration date on the currency. So if you didn't spend the currency by the expiration date, it either expired or you got penalized. So now you can see why I'm so concerned about the implementation of CBDCs. But let's come on to the stages now then, the 5 stages that I've identified, which by you actually looking at these and monitoring them, you'll see in advance what's actually happening. So let's begin with stage 1, which actually happened last year, and we're deep into stage 1 now, which is to give out free stimulus to people. And this was a very successful project by the government, because people didn't save this money. No, they took their stimulus, they went out and spent it. So this did several things that were positive for the government. Number 1, it was a proof of concept case for them, knowing that CBDCs would work in a similar fashion. Number 2, it created money velocity, so they got more tax revenue. And number 3, it created more inflation, because you now had more currency chasing the same amount or fewer goods because of the supply chain breakdowns. And what does inflation do for government debt? It inflates it away. Stage 2 then, I think, is no more than 2 to 4 years away perhaps. And that is the implementation of something like a UBI, a universal basic income, or even if we don't see that, some sort of welfare payment that will only be paid to people via digital wallets. Now, you might say, but why would the government do that? How would they justify it? Very simply, and here's the line, we need to get these funds out to families quicker. Families are suffering. They can't wait 3 or 4 days to get these payments. They need these payments immediately, within minutes. This is the sort of thing that they'll come up with in order to justify the digital wallets. Stage 3, I think, is again anywhere from 1 to 4 or 5 years away, where I think the government will give an incentive to a large number of citizens, or maybe a smaller number of a test group, to download these digital wallets so that the government could then give you some free CBDC. Again, they trialed this in China. It was very successful because look, who's going to turn down free money? Now let's talk about stage 4 then, which it will really vary in terms of timeline. It could be 1 year, it could be 10 years. It depends on the different countries, because some countries are a lot further along with implementing a CBDC than others. So stage 4 will be the nationwide implementation of the CBDC and digital wallets for all citizens. But how could they do this, Neil, you may ask? Well, I think they will mandate, as they have already been doing recently, they will mandate something that's a lot easier to implement, and that is that all citizens must download a digital wallet. Now, you might say, well, people just won't do it. Aha, this is where the mandate comes in for employers. So employers will be mandated to pay the wages of employees into these digital wallets. They won't be allowed to pay them into banks anymore. But what if the employer doesn't want to do it? There will be a large penalty on that employer to stop them from breaking the rules. But what about cash? What about people who are paid in cash? Again, I have a theory on this, especially around cash. I think each time someone takes their cash into the bank will take that cash and destroy it. and instead they'll deposit into your account a CBDC, because I don't think banks are just going to be outlawed straight away. You will see banks and the central government, the CBDC, running side by side. So banks will actually have some sort of a digital wallet where they will manage your CBDC for you. So I think this is going to be phased out. So banks will eventually be phased out because, again, why will the central bank need these commercial banks anymore? They won't. And just in case the banks do hang on, I think the central government then, the CBDC, they'll say something along the lines of, right, citizens, your funds, your savings in the bank are no longer safe anymore. The insurance, the FDIC, or the insurance for your country is no longer valid. So it's up to you. You either leave your money in the bank, in the savings account, or you put them into the government account here, the central bank account, which is safe. And look how many of these banks are going bankrupt and having problems at the moment. See, this is the sort of propaganda that will get put out. And then stage 5, I think, is very, very long term. This could be 20 years or so into the future. And that is the one coin to rule them all. What do I mean by this? Well, if you think of an example here, let me give you an example of how many currencies there used to be. Thousands of different currencies. Now in the world, there are only around 180 currencies left. That's it. And look what happens when a currency dies. Look what happens to Venezuela or some of these other currencies. What do they do instead? They go to a stronger currency, like the US dollar for Venezuela, for example. But just look how many other countries use the US dollar as their currency or as their second currency. What do you think is going to happen as more currencies have currency crises? Because again, we are at the end of this current cycle of these currencies. They will eventually die. What is it? 98% of them now is debt. Only 2% is actual value there. So they are a ticking time bomb. And then we'll see more consolidations. Look what happened in the Eurozone, where there were all these different currencies. Well, now what do they use? They use the euro, which again is having problems of its own. So what happens when one of these larger currencies starts to fail? Well, I think, and it's just a theory, but I think maybe something like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, backed up by our friends at the World Economic Forum, that's a joke by the way, for those of you who take everything I say seriously, could then create this digital SDR and a DSDR or something similar to that, because remember the IMF has large gold reserves. They could back some of their currency with gold reserves. And just think how many countries are in debt to the IMF right now. The IMF owns some countries via the collateral they've got with the debt, the money that they've loaned these countries. And in my mind, this really would be a worst case scenario. I think it's crazy the amount of people who are waving the flag for the IMF and the World Economic Forum, thinking these are great institutions. These are private institutions. You have to remember that. They are private institutions pushing certain agendas. And just imagine if you have a private organization actually that controls the governments of the world, especially if they have a one coin or a one CBDC, because you've heard the expression many times before, but he who controls, or she who controls the currency supply, controls the people, controls everything.